Okay, so let me set the stage by introducing our incredible speakers. First up, we have Nigel Thurlow, which I think that's a name that most of you already know. He is a world-renowned expert in lean, flow, and complex systems thinking. As the former chief of Agile at Toyota and co-creator of the Flow system, Nigel brings decades of experience working with global enterprises on innovation and leadership transformation. And then we have our very own Luan Oliveira, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at Businessmap and a trusted voice in digital transformation, agile operations, and enterprise strategy. He works directly with senior leaders to align big picture vision with scalable, intelligent execution. Both of them, of course, are particularly interested and involved with the topic of AI in business, specifically leadership and strategy execution. So I honestly couldn't think of two people who would be better fit to bring together from one from the States, one from Brazil in this virtual room and give them the stage to dive deeper into the subject because they don't just talk about change, they actually lead it. And I think that's really crucial to have people who have hands-on experience. So we will have a Q&A session today. Please do take advantage of it. And overall, today's conversation, we're going to explore the real opportunities that AI unlocks for leaders, challenges and pitfalls that we should be aware of, and the risks, and maybe even touch upon the ethical dilemmas that come with giving AI more decision-making power. So let's start with opportunities. Let's start on a positive note. Nigel, Luan, welcome. We haven't rehearsed this. There's no script. So, oops, sorry. I will put Nigel here up on the screen for you guys. I would like for us to open up with the opportunities and maybe how AI is an enabler as a machine serving business leaders. Welcome. It's awesome to have you.
Thank you. I'm really pleased I'm here, but my introduction was fantastic, but I'm looking at some of the people in the conference and thinking they're far more expert at things than I am. So I'm going to be tested by some of the people in the audience there. I see a lot of people I know in the industry. So, but I'm great. It's great to be here, Luan.
Nigel, thanks. It's great to be here with you. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Veronica, for the introduction. Yeah, well, I've been working quite a while with techie, but my focus has always been on results, on business. So let's see what we can discuss today.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, of course, I've been releasing all sorts of little things on LinkedIn and other platforms, sort of playing around with what possibilities are there within AI at the moment. And I think one of the things that strikes me is that the difference between this and AI has been around since the early 50s. There's a bit of a debate going on about the exact date, but it's somewhere around the early 50s. And it's just an evolution of automation. But the difference this time is automation with reasoning. So that's a human-like characteristic. It's ability to think, consider, decide on a course of action, and then for us to give it agency, which is sort of a bit scary but also exciting when we start to talk about agentic AI, this ability for the system to operate independently of humans, whereas traditional automation tends to be algorithmic. It's deterministic. We give it a thing to do and you give it some parameters and it just repeats that ad nauseum and speeds up things that we would normally have to do ourselves, make decisions ourselves. And that goes way back to the early days of Toyota. But this new thing with automation is that we don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to give it all the parameters. We don't have to give it an algorithm. We just set it off and it makes decisions depending on the inputs that it's receiving. And I think that's a fundamental difference to the automation world. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Nigel, I totally agree with the agents nowadays, but yeah, these days I'm more inclined to think about the execution because the AI agents, they hallucinate sometimes, right? But what I see most of the companies, regardless of AI, is where you have a strategy, you design a strategy, and sometimes you spend months designing a strategy. And then when it comes to execution, there's no execution. So that's the biggest hallucination that I've ever seen. And it doesn't depend on AI agents. So when it comes to leaders and the AI applications of it, is that AI will help leaders to discover that they don't have an actual strategy that can be doable, that can be delivered.
It's interesting when you talk about hallucinations, because for the audience benefit, that's the large language models. That's the sort of, if you like, the AI database behind the scenes. And typically, if it doesn't have an answer, it'll make something up. And there's been lots of hilarious examples of that. I do wonder if, I sometimes talk about something called the Peter Principle. We may even return to that later on. But it was a professor way back in the day, in the 60s, who sort of described leaders getting appointed into positions which they don't have the skills to execute on. And I wonder whether or not leaders have been hallucinating anyway for years, making things up based upon lack of knowledge, and all we've now done is automated that same hallucination.
Exactly. That's what we see most of the time. There's no strategy. Companies say my strategy is to grow 20% per year or 50% per year, but what does it really mean? Where is the growth coming from? What is the competitive advantage that you're leveraging, right?
So, I started to dig into some of my content, and I'm just pulling up some of the notes I was scribbling down on post-it notes before we got together today. Because when I start to look at this from a lean perspective, and you're right, people, companies have got a strategy to grow, but then you get into things like Goodhart's law, which sort of talks about measures becoming targets, ceasing to be a good measure. And a lot of organizations set for, the world of OKRs we now inhabit, where organizations are setting growth targets or financial targets or something that drives us towards some arbitrary number, fiscal target, which really to me isn't a strategy. That's an outcome. A strategy should be much more focused on how do we create better quality, better products, better opportunities, whatever the right words are, and the financials come as a consequence of that. But when I start to look at this in a little bit more detail, and I'm starting to think about what do we do from a lean perspective? And I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday, who's a real sort of hands-on lean practitioner, works with a lot of organizations that are struggling to improve the way they do things. And I started to muse this idea of latency, because a lot of us are techies, so we all sort of understand latency. And when you get buffering on your connections around the world, or you'll get poor Netflix performance, we start to think about bandwidth and latency. Well, I started to translate that into, well, what does that mean from a point of view of a lean practitioner? And I start to look at, well, throughput through the system, how much we can get through a system in a given amount of time is the typical measure lean people use. And indeed, techies use that when they're talking about data throughput. So that's the amount of units of value we can create in a given amount of time. But then we start to think about the bandwidth, which is the capacity. But my favorite word, the latency, that's the delays in the system, often caused by dependencies, interruptions, other forms of delays, bureaucracy, bad management, bad decision making, silos. So then I think, okay, we can go and increase capacity by just pouring a ton of money in and buying more labor, buying more physical capacity, be it in machines or people. But there's a really high cost associated with that. And as you scale that, you scale all the bad. If you scale the system, you scale all the bad stuff you failed to get rid of. Whereas if you rid yourself of that latency before you scale, then the result is likely to be more effective at a much lower or even a zero cost. So how can we leverage AI for this? So if AI can start to look at poor administrative procedures, when we look at compliance and document processing and research and these types of things, how can we leverage AI to eliminate that latency in the system and give us that benefit? Now, I do go back to the principles of Toyota in what we call Jidoka, which sort of predates a lot of these conversations, which is automation with the human touch, roughly sort of interpreted, which is the Toyota sort of principle of using automation to serve mankind, not mankind serving the automation, and not using automation to replace jobs, but to actually make it safer or more effective for machines to do certain jobs so humans can redeploy that capability, that intellect, that knowledge for more creative work, more innovative work. So I start to look at it from that perspective and think, well, there's a lot of jobs that are just boring, repetitive, highly administrative, which we could put into the world of AI now. I also look at, when I'm looking at a system, be it a mechanical system or a digital system, how can we use AI to identify where the waste is, the latency, the non-value added activity in the system, in the physical world, using sensors and digital measurement technology to balance the flow on a production line, or within tools like yours, how do we use the AI to detect the anomalies, the things we're not seeing as humans, because we're too busy to sort of actually see the things in our peripheral, and identifying that and making suggestions to a continuous improvement manager, an OPEX professional or something, of how we can improve the system. So that's where I'm heading with a little bit of this at the moment. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Nigel, back in 2016, I was working with kind of a genius. He's called Gerhard as a PhD, and the guy was playing around with AI, and we are in a context of a telecom company, one maybe the largest one, and there were 700 systems, and the AI was trying to see the value streams across 700 different IT systems, and what are the interactions with them, and what are the architectural impacts of changing something somewhere. So that's quite a few years ago, and quite back in the days where AI wasn't accessible through ChatGPT and tools like we are seeing today, DeepSeek, etc. Nowadays, actually in 2022, when I moved to Businessmap, that was my click, that was my insight. How can we map the business, and how can we see not from one value stream, not from one leader perspective? Because if you see well-trained leaders and engineering and IT in different roles in the industry, they are good at identifying the bottlenecks at their place where they work with the people they work with. They are very good at identifying the bottlenecks. But when you put together in a room multiple leaders, all of them will ask for automation. All of them will ask for increase of headcount. So when you go one level up into the executive level, they look at all the leaders asking for more people, asking for more tooling, but they cannot map the business, and they cannot see the gaps across the value streams, across multiple organizations, value streams, or business units, right? And it's very hard, very tough for them to make a decision where to add more money and where to remove money. Because I don't see any leader saying, yes, I'm okay. I have 2 additional people here. I can get rid of these people and continue to perform the same level I perform today. I have never seen a leader speaking like that. So the real trigger that I see with good tooling that can, with AI empowered solutions, to map the organizational bottlenecks and really help the organization to remove the bottleneck that makes sense for the business in that point in time.
Yeah, I mean, of course, value streams are dear to my heart, and sort of all value stream thinking and sort of what we used to call, or what we do call in Toyota materials, and information flow analysis or diagramming. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, we've got these technologies within AI now. We've got these large language models, and many of us sit down playing around with the, Chat GPT or Perplexity or Grok or any of them, and we have conversations with them, which is weird, but it's how you work with these to prompt them. I can imagine a world, or imagine even perhaps even in your own development, your own way of thinking, where we start to have agents, or whatever you want to call them, the technology we can train to understand how we do what we do, the work we do, and how it's supposed to flow in the system. So the agents can start to identify these bottlenecks and start to have conversations or prompt us. In fact, when I was working on some web page postings the other night, the AI is prompting me, do you want this? Do you want that? Would you like me to do this for you? Would you like me to create a software package and download the Python scripts, yada, yada, yada? It's actually asking me questions now, which is, just a sign of the things to come. So if we get to a place where we've got the technology deployed without all the fancy language, we've just deployed the technology, so it's got hooks or connectivity into our various systems of how work flows and how work is done. And the most important thing in value streams when you're mapping it is the flow of information. That's the difference between a process map and a value stream map. We're mapping the flow of information, not just the flow of work. Most of that flow of information is digitized somewhere, so that we can imagine this technology now being a hook into that to identify it and to start having its reasoning, its consideration based upon its training, based upon its interactions with the humans, to start understanding how the system should be flowing if it was optimized, and then start to talk to us and make suggestions to us. Have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Or, by the way, Nigel, do you realize when it goes into this department, this process, we get stagnation? My old boss at Toyota told me the opposite of flow is stagnation. And one of the things we're looking to do when we map a value stream is identify those points of stagnation, what Goldratt would have called a constraint in the system, so that we can alleviate that constraint. That's where I think this is potentially going, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think that, we can come back to the conversation about strategy and leaders and executives about helping them define better strategy, but then the hallucinatory sort of side of it is a problem. But actually looking at their existing systems and just trying to optimize their existing systems. One of the things I often say to leaders is, what do you do if I could give you the equivalent of 20% more headcount, more people, more teams? What would you do with that without additional investment? Well, if we can eliminate this waste, this inefficiency in the system, then we could potentially create that capacity, which is something I talk about a lot, is creating capacity in organizations. That's where I think the opportunities are here, not just replacing people, but there's lots of evidence of that. I was in a discussion the other week with Amazon, and KPMG were presenting a case study in South Australia for Safety SA, which is the health and safety executive basically in Australia, and using AI to process all their compliance and paperwork and lots of documentation, created the equivalent of 70 new safety inspectors. We could see that as it replaced the need to hire 70 new inspectors. So you can see it from both perspectives. But that's where I think the opportunities are here. Well, at least the immediate opportunities.
I agree, Nigel. Now, I'm listening to you. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about where do we cross the line between decentralizing the decisions, because we are being asked good questions from AI now. We're asking them better questions. We're learning, and at least we hope people are learning how to evolve their jobs and their professionals. Otherwise, yes, they're going to be replaced. So as we progress on that aspect, we are seeing that leaders decentralize decision making and empower people to make decisions. But on the other side, we are seeing sometimes leaders abdicating leadership. So where do we cross the line there?
It's funny because I wrote down a whole bunch of post-it notes, and I really did write lots of post-it notes before we came, just to give myself a bunch of things to think about. And when we talk about agentic AI, which is, of course, this multi-agent technology, multi-agent systems, which is where, and you can hear about RAG, augmented sort of, it's the technique, I forget what the acronym stands for. It's the most awful acronym. But anyway, it's using the technology to send out multiple agents to do multiple different types of work to help you make faster, better decisions, or apparently that's the sales pitch. But when we talk about something that's agentic, it's a person who's self-organizing, proactive, self-reflecting. I wrote this down, self-regulating. They're able to make their own choices and act independently. And then we start to look at these movements out there called mob AI now. So like mob programming, but now using AI as team members, whether it's a complete team of AIs or it's, well, and I don't know what the pronoun is for AI. I'm sure somebody will give me some suggestions in the chat. But AI becomes a team member. And I was actually having a conversation with somebody from Amazon the other day where they were starting to talk about needing team training for teams which would collaborate with AI and multi-agent systems as team members. So then we get into what you're talking about, which is where, whether it's a manager, a team leader, or a team member, giving agency, giving power of attorney to the AI to make a decision. Then I could imagine, coming back to some of the things about management hallucination and Peter Principle and, fun things like that, where the team leader becomes AI. And the team leader makes decisions. And somebody remarked to me the other day about Tesla, what's Tesla good at? People think, Tesla is a car company, and of course we know Elon's into space exploration and other things and doing some cool stuff, despite his sometimes controversial approach. But what did Tesla do better than most people? And this is, and I wrote this down, teams that can deliver technology. What they're really good at is building amazing teams that can build technology, whatever that technology space is. Now, and we know Tesla's heavy into AI with Grok, and I use Grok a lot, and it's damn well impressive. Now we can imagine having Grok or Grok agents as team members of these amazing, lightweight, rapid adapting teams that are good at building technology. So I think that's some of the direction we're heading in. And maybe some managers will be replaced by AI. If you go into Chase Bank and ask for a loan nowadays, it's the computer that gives a yes/no decision. The manager can't give a decision. And I can tell you, because a couple of years ago when I asked about this, they told me it doesn't matter where you might as well apply online because we have no power to make a decision. And that wasn't really AI. That was just an algorithm making a decision based on your credit rating and other factors. But we're moving into a position where these tools will be used to do some of this decision making, and maybe it'll be better decision making.
Yes. And I'm thinking about two directions here, Nigel. One of them is face the brutal reality, because when you digest all this data and you generate from AI, etc., sometimes it doesn't make sense. The same way that today people spend days, sometimes weeks, building a beautiful report for the executives to show what's going on in the company. And when AI does that, it extrapolates the reality, and you can get wrong data. So it's always important to do a Gamba or a quality assurance checkpoint and get real. There's one good example from Jeff Bezos where he was seeing great customer satisfaction scores. The calls were really short. The tickets were closed very fast. And then he says, this doesn't make sense, right? I'm hearing complaints all the time. And he makes a call to the call center during the meeting, and they spend minutes and minutes waiting and nothing happens. The problem is not solved. So it's always important for leaders, in my perspective, to, yes, empower AI, but get real. Do your checkpoint. Go to the Gamba and make sure that the numbers and the reports are reflecting the reality. Now, moving to another direction, I was thinking about the knowledge management and how we transfer this knowledge from leaders to leaders. Let's let's say Steve Jobs. No, we don't have Steve Jobs anymore at Apple, and Tim Cook is a completely different leader. Um, it's different. We can say if it's better or worse, but we definitely can say it's not innovative as Jobs, right? And what will happen with, again, Elon Musk, controversial topic, but he's a genius. And then you have Bezos and other leaders nowadays. What will happen in the future, and how do you think we can preserve and keep the knowledge in the company?
You know, you raise an interesting point. It's quite funny we mention a few of these leaders, and so a lot of people, and I had a big debate with Steve Denning and a few other folks in a think tank a year or so ago about what makes a great leader. And if you look at people like Bezos, Musk, Jobs, and others, they're tyrants. They have a tyrannical leadership. Now, I don't mean tyrants, you know, in the worst sense of the word, but they are pretty dogmatic, dictatorial, demanding. They're a very specific type of character. And when you look at Tim Cook versus Jobs, now we only have the public persona. I mean, I'm not an inside person, so I wouldn't know. Tim Cook might be just as demanding and as driven as Steve Jobs, or it may just be that they're a $3 trillion company and they can just coast along quite happily now. Who knows? But it's amusing because you start to think, and I'll get to the Gemba thing in a minute because I think that's a really important thing with physical AI developments as well. But imagine if you start to encode the personas, the personalities, the thought patterns, the thought processes of these leaders into an AI model, which then starts to enable strategy or be participating in strategy decisions, the direction of the future of the company, the organization. And AI becomes a tyrant driving the company. That's just an amusing anecdote there. Maybe we'll get to that when we look at some of the pitfalls and worries about this. But look, the Gemba. So I'm a big Gemba guy, and Bobby Miliani and others are on this chat on this session that I recognize who are big proponents of going to Gemba. And for those that don't know, Gemba just means the real place, the actual place the work is done. But I did make a comment about identifying, you know, how to better balance a production line if you're in the physical world. Because in the digital world, we do this. We're bobbleheads on the end of cameras, and we think that's going to Gemba. And I often ask companies that do a lot of this, how do you go to Gemba? How do you insert yourself in the workflow without scaring everybody to death because you pop up in a Teams meeting and say, pretend I'm not here? You know, well, that's never going to work. No psychological safety there. So, but when you go to Gemba, you sort of engage with the people, you engage with the work, you go there, you observe, you learn is the most important thing, and you don't make any assumptions, but then you take action based upon what you've learned and what you've been asked to help. And I coined a phrase some time ago that red doesn't mean bad. So on a status report, red isn't bad. Red means I need help. And so that type of thing happens when you go to the Gemba. But then I started watching what NVIDIA are doing with the chips, and even Toyota's a customer of NVIDIA and many other companies as well, where they're moving into the world of physical AI. And I was even watching this morning a BMX rider leaping on and off tables and performing stunts, but the rider was a robot. It was a robotic bike with a robotic rider. And I'm thinking, you stick AI in that and all sorts of possibilities come to mind. But what NVIDIA are doing in the physical AI world, they're training the AI model in a digital world. So they're using real world footage. And in their example, again at CES, more than 20 million hours of real live video footage in warehousing, supply chain, logistics. They're then encoding that digitally and training the models so they can take that training data, put it on a $500 chip on a physical machine with actuators and other mechanics and things, that it can now go to Gemba. It's in the physical world. It can either perform actions or it can start to observe the activity on the production line, in the warehouse, in the physical world, and then start to make determinations, make decisions, process that, and start to think. And that's where I think people like continuous improvement managers or leaders or OPEX people, process improvement people, could start to leverage that by having eyes in the Gemba all the time, not as a spy. We're not talking about eyes, you know, spies in the workforce, but we're talking about a way to monitor and understand how the physical world is running. And in the digital world, that technology exists, it's feasible and possible. And again, not from a spy point of view, but from an understanding point of view. But as you start to gather all this vast amount of data, we humans aren't capable of processing it rapidly enough and looking at all the possible permutations of the data we're processing. It's what data scientists spend their occupation trying to build the models that can process that data and make it meaningful for us. Now, do I foresee a world where the human doesn't make a decision, doesn't process the sort of meaningful data and then actually make a decision? I think that's likely to happen in some contexts. And we talk about logical depth, which is, the quality of the information and the usefulness of that information. There are some, when we get into information theory, we start to look at the cost of obtaining those appropriate answers. And that's what, back to your beginning, when you talk about strategy, the strategists who are trying to figure out what direction to go in need to make sense of the meaningful data, the actionable or valuable data rapidly. And I think that's where AI is going to win out.
Yeah, the sense making is super critical.
Veronica's back. That tells us we're
yeah,
there's a certain point.
Pop up with questions because I do think you guys have some really interesting insights on the challenges and the pitfalls, and I think your point of views are very they will be very valuable because you guys work with leaders and you also are leaders. So we hear a lot of fear mongering, and maybe some of it is real, maybe some of it is not. We hear things like, a company doesn't need employees anymore, they'll all be AI workers, or there's going to be no need for a CEO because AI will make all the decisions. But I'm curious, what's your take on, what are the risks and the pitfalls specifically from a leader or a business decision maker's point of view? What are things that are just scare talk, and what's actual risk that they should be aware of in the future when making decisions?
There was I'm trying to find the name. I was just quickly looking. I can't remember the name of it. There's a Swiss fintech. Their CEO came out the other day and said, we're no longer employing anybody. We are, as people leave through natural attrition, they'll be replaced with AI. Now, of course, that was a bold statement to make, and they employ a few thousand people in the fintech industry. I think that, look, if we're realistic, automation over the years has replaced people in other work. So if we look at the welders on a production line, most welding now in large-scale manufacturing is done by robots, has been done for years for several reasons. They're faster, faster, more accurate, and for people it's safer. It removes people from an environment which is dangerous and not great for their health. But it means that now that skill set of welding, and I mean, there's plenty of fabricators around the world. I know people around the world are in fabrication. But in some areas, automation has replaced the people doing that work for good reason, for lots of good reasons: safety, accuracy, and for efficiency. And I think that when you talk about repetitive work, laborious work, administrative functional work, a lot of deep research sometimes, I think that AI will replace people in those roles. One of the things I was talking in this other event I was in was about how people doing compliance work, which is typically a small team doing a large amount of work to ensure certain applications or people submitting certain documents are compliant and meet certain criteria, and being able to identify where there's gaps that need to be addressed by applicants or people submitting compliance in documentation. And that's now being taken over by AI. They're still leaving a human in the circuit, in the sort of circle of trust, so that just to validate that AI is getting it right more than it's not getting it right. But there was a statistic came out that was used in this event that humans get it wrong 2 to 3% of the time. AI is now getting it wrong less than 1% of the time. And that's back to the hallucinations, training the models, making sure they have the right knowledge, the right data, or whatever you want to call it, so they can make their accurate decisions. So I think certainly that type of work will be replaced by this new evolution of automation. I also think when we look at AI technology in driving, forgetting the noise around Tesla stuff and Mark Rober doing his YouTube video recently. I think things like long distance truck drivers, where we've got, 40, 50 ton vehicles hurtling up and down 2,000-mile long interstates. I think that will be replaced by AI. I think, well, automated driving systems which will be driven by AI capability, decision making and things, because they can pull out of one depot and they can haul ass for 500 miles without stopping, without resting, without sleeping, and thankfully keeping to the speed limit and not pulling out into the overtaking lanes and throwing debris all over my vehicle, which is welcome to America, and then pulling at another depot 500 miles down the road. And so I think work like that will be replaced by this new evolution of automation. But automation is an evolution, and over the last 50 years it has evolved, and there are many things that machines do or technology does now that we humans don't do. But that principle of Jidoka, which is the machine serving the humans, not the other way around, I think is the important distinction here. Luan, I don't know what experience if you've got with some of your clients and customers. And
well, you gave a pretty comprehensive answer. If I may add to it, I would get from a perspective on how can we use AI to hire better and to fire faster. So how can we hire better? How can we determine who's the right person to the right place? I always believe in a diverse team with different personalities, with different perspectives. I think that adds up, and then you can create a great, strong team. Like in any sports, you must different muscles in different positions in the field to perform better. So I have the same philosophy in my teams and the organizations I work with. And from the firing, you can, as you mentioned, you can have people who are toxic. You didn't say toxic leaders, but they can be toxic leaders, and we see all the time toxic leaders who are promoted because they are doing a good job at delivering the results, right? So how can AI help us to determine that? And I give you one example. I do have an AI assistant installed on all my sales and marketing people. When they are having a meeting with a customer or a potential customer, the AI is there and is monitoring the empathy, how the person is behaving with the customer internally in the team. So how can you monitor the behavior of the person and determine if it's a good fit, a good cultural fit for the company, for the organization or not? And fire who is delivering results on the short term, but on the long term is going to hurt the business, the company. In addition, you talk a lot about sense making and collecting data to make better decisions, but sometimes that's very, very tough. If you are going through a tough moment in your life, if you lose someone, or you're going through a challenging moment, right? Then how can AI or a leader or anything collect that kind of data to show that to the company that that's just a moment? This person has been great for so many years, has a track record, very good, but this is a moment that is not performing well. And that's not a reason to fire the person. So how can we leverage AI to help us be better leaders and people management?
I'm glad you brought this up, because my lean background, my Toyota background, and many of the people I'm seeing, Andre and others, some people I know very well on this call, we believe that we don't want to fire anybody. That we set out with the intent that people have a job for as long as they want to have a job. And so how can AI help us identify opportunities for coaching, mentorship, training, guidance, that type of thing? How do we identify when somebody, as you said, isn't performing optimally or as expected or as desired within the culture or the organization of the company? We don't want LLMs to start, the technologies start becoming the tyrannical leaders of the future. That's not what we're not looking at. Skynet, Matrix, and all this sort of stuff. So yes, we want to avoid, bias biasing these. I mean, there's a lot of trouble with a lot of challenges with how we train these models. But you mentioned sense making. Now, sense making, the technique of sense making, is how do we use storytelling and narrative and other signifiers for us to be able to understand the environment, the culture, the temperature within an organization, even within a culture, within a country, within a group, an organization. And I think that having AI behind the scenes to be able to process that and interpret that data. As you know, I work with Dave Snowden a lot, and he has a tool called SenseMaker. But how can he and others leverage AI to be able to look at those patterns, look at that data? Today, it's done by teams of extremely talented analysts. Whenever I use sense making as a technique, I always employ the analysts because they just know how to structure the sense making activities and then how to analyze the data. But once machines can do that, or once the technology can do that and help us see the patterns and the heat maps and the weak signals and the things that we're missing because we're too focused on going forward to worry about what's happening here, then I think that's another opportunity, and it will enable us to find those dark constraints, the things that we can see the impact of or the effect of, but we don't know what's causing it, which may lead to inappropriate behaviors, or whether it's toxic management or just bad decision making or something. Now, of course, what we do with that, and whether it's the AI that makes a decision of what those actions are, that's a whole different scary direction we could go in.
Great. Mapping the business mapping requires the people, the process, the platforms, right?
I think so. And then we get into, I mean, Veronica will tell us when it's done, but we get into things like the Fermi paradox and the work of Carl Sagan and other stuff, which takes us into that. What are the negatives? I mean, I'm seeing lots of questions that people have put in about, how much authority, agency, and power should we give it? And somebody actually put something in here. I'll just click on a question here. They sort of, the question is, AI just the new Google? Is it Google 2.0? Is it just better search? The difference is, and the thing I encourage people to do when you use any of these tools like ChatGPT or any of them, is don't look at the answers it's giving you. Look at how it got to the answers. You see this reasoning box with some of these deep think models that are now there. Click on that and look at how it's thinking about how to address whatever you've asked it to do. That's where we get into this point where it's got this ability to do synthetic human-like reasoning. And as that gets better and better and more powerful, and depending on how it's training itself, I mean, the worry is that these models just go out to the internet and just gather everything on the internet and use that as training models, the good, the bad, the ugly. And of course, all the conspiracy stuff and the misinformation, disinformation out there, how does it delineate between that? And there's only a certain amount of human training and human correction that we can give it. The reward models we use to train these large language models, as what North Korea says is bad and what America says is good, but if you're in North Korea, what America says is bad, what North Korea says is good. So it's all a matter of perspective and lens. But the problem is these LLMs are being trained by whatever data it's being given access to. And so it's, Raphael's saying, Lean has shown the industry a disruptive way of thinking, a new way of thinking in manufacturing processes. AI does not create new knowledge, only processes the current knowledge. I actually don't agree with that. I actually think AI is capable of creating new knowledge. Now, is it fake? Is it a hallucination? Is it just a lot of made up mumbo jumbo? Or is it looking at different things and creating new hypotheses to be tested? Could it then test that hypothesis? Could it look for its own empirical answers to its own theories? I don't know, but I mean, I appreciate new knowledge is some knowledge that never existed previously. So how do you create that? But what do I do? What does my business partner do as a real professor? He synthesizes, he gathers knowledge from peer-reviewed literature and other books and other publications, other sources. He then synthesizes that and comes up with new theories, new ideas, and then makes a proposition, which is a hypothesis to be tested. And then we'll run some experiments, whether it's in the real world or hypothetical experiments, and that will determine whether that hypothesis synthesized from other knowledge is verifiable. Why can't AI do that? I don't know. But it's something I expect to see happening.
Nigel, yeah, well, partially agree with it because you don't ever create something brand new. It's always chemistry, always combining existing elements and then creating something new, but actually it's a new combination of existing elements. Now, I'm also thinking about how people get attached to the kind of music they listen when they are teenagers. And then when something comes up that's new, they simply ignore it after a couple of decades, right? That's common. And what will happen with AI when a new theory, that's a good one, when the new link comes up, when the new TPS, the new Toyota production system comes up, how much weight AI will give to it, giving it something new. And that's also a risk because there's a lot of things that are not scientific nowadays in the internet and people discuss and talk about it. So if AI starts to embed pseudo-scientific behavior, that can be really dangerous for the humanity as well, right? So how do we draw the line? How do we guide AI to keep embedding new knowledge? Don't ignore new knowledge that's being created because it's being created all the time. There are no great rock bands nowadays, right? But we ignore most of them. So how can we prevent AI to ignore new science approach and be careful about dangerous non-scientific approaches?
So this really takes us down the ethical path, and I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat from Victoria that sort of leans a little bit this way as well. You have to remember that all AI developments for the moment are for profit. Now, even, ChatGPT, supposedly, are not for profit. But let's look at all the big money that's associated with ChatGPT from Microsoft, and then all these other companies are for-profit companies. So they're using this technology or creating this technology to sell to people who are prepared to give money. I pay my $20 a month for ChatGPT as an example. I get Grok with my X subscription, although I hate the whole Twitter X environment, but I get access to Grok and go play with it. I pay my $89 a month for technology from HeyGen to animate myself and make silly videos. But the point is this, all these things are for profit. They're a business model. And even Trump in his recent statements about bringing AI to America and this huge amount of investment in AI technology, it's all for making money. So at the end of the day, who's going to regulate this? Who's going to ensure, as you say, that AI doesn't disregard new science, new fact, new data, new or interesting things? And, to music, and we all love our music, and some of us out there are musicians. I'm certainly not. But AI can now write song lyrics from nothing and can actually compose music and then sing the songs for you. And there's platforms out there doing it right now. It might be horrific and awful, but everything was horrific and awful once. The first phones were pretty rudimentary. Now these things, you can't live without them by your side, and so the technology evolves and improves. And the worry is, where does the line blur? Do we understand the difference between reality and synthetic environments? And I joke about the TikTok generation and these people, stop the scroll generation, whereas, they're just feeding endless information on platforms like Instagram and TikTok and whatever else is out there now. It will be soon that there'll be so much synthetic content being pushed through those systems. And we're older, I'm older. you're not quite as old as me, Luan, but we're getting on now, and so we're not the target demographic for this. Ultimately we'll age out of this system in a decade or so, yeah, if not before. But the Gen Zers, the Gen Alphas, and whatever they call the generation that come, they're the generation that is going to be feeding into this, and they will just accept it. It'll just be, yeah. I mean, we just accept now we have 500 TV channels in America that 99% of them are just absolute drivel, but we don't, they're there, and some people soak them up, and the people watch some of the most inane stuff that's pouring out of social media and out of televisions nowadays. So it'll just get worse. It'll just be, AI will just become, nobody will even call it AI. It'll just be stuff that's part of the fabric of what the modern life is, and we won't differentiate it. And that's where we start to worry, because these for-profit organizations, if they're giving the tools to other for-profit organizations to make more money, then a lot of this ethical stuff is, whatever, who cares about that?
I do, but but we have a certain extent and ability to influence that, right? Considering the new generations, I do have 3 daughters, right? 9, 12, and 15 years old. So I'm seeing that all the time. Yesterday, I went to see Minecraft movie with them on a theater, and the jokes are different, the behavior is different. Certainly the shopping behavior is different, everything, right? Lifestyle, the way they want to live, behave, where they want to travel to, what they drink. The consumption of alcohol has dropped significantly in the new generation. So it's a completely different people. And when we are talking about AI and how AI will support them, and how the business will hire these people and what kind of jobs they will have, it's certainly going to change a lot over the next few years, right? But I still see, I have hope in the future. My 2 older daughters, they're learning about programming languages and robotics, and they're quite interested into it. So I'm hopeful.
It's the one thing, and look, we have historical precedent of this. We have this thing called automation bias, human enfeeblement. These are things we need to be concerned about, because, since the advent of these and other devices in our cars, we no longer use maps. I joke in some of my presentations, I said, if you gave a 15-year-old a map book, an A to Z of London or wherever, could they use it? Could they plot a route? Could they navigate using a paper map? And a lot of people couldn't. I mean, I asked even my son, who's 25, about changing a spare wheel on his car, if he gets a puncture. He has no idea how to do it. But these are things that I learned to do as a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s, because that was the world I was in. We had no money. You had to be able to do this stuff. But we've lost those skills, which is human enfeeblement. The danger is that critical thinking, and Microsoft published a report recently on this, critical thinking and critical thinking skills, and the ability for humans to do some of these things in your daughter's generations are being lost because we just let the machines do it now. And that becomes another fear. And of course, that becomes, then you become great customers for somebody who can provide those services, because you're no longer able to do these things. And so now you depend. So there is that nefarious idea. Let's use the AI to enfeeble the human race, so that the human race then need to spend money with me because I'm the only person who can still do it. I'm coming up with business ideas as I'm talking here. Veronica, we got a bunch of questions and a little bit of time. I don't know whether
Yeah,
you
I know.
want to
You did a good job, Nigel, at addressing some of the questions in the Q&A. There is one asked by Pablo that states, in your view, is AI going to be regulated somehow, and how do you think that is going to change the current landscape? We've talked about AI creating information, ignoring information, hallucinating, or creating new ideas. But yeah, how do we regulate all of that?
I think from my perspective, I mean, I'll let Luan answer because he's got the European perspective. I think from my perspective now as a Brit, now as an American living in the US, I think Pandora's box is open, the cat's out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle, whatever metaphor you want to use. And I don't think it's possible to rein that in. And even if you regulated it in the US and in Europe, and I think Europe's got a different stance at the moment, or the UK, that you're not going to regulate it in places like China, Russia, North Korea, these places. Because what are you going? Oh, AI is not allowed to do this, that, and the other, and I can just see, North Korea signing up to that charter. It's just not going to happen. So whether we try and regulate it, I don't think it's. I don't know, Luan. What's your thoughts as a European?
I'm Brazilian actually, but I do have
Oh, I'm
quite
so
a
sorry. I didn't realize that. I'm
European
sorry.
perspective of it. Don't worry. Well, I'm going to Europe for over a month next week, so I'm not a European, but I feel like today.
What's the Brazilian perspective on this? Then I was just assuming because of Businessmap's location. So apologies for that, but
No, it's quite similar. If you think about GDPR, for example, we do have a regulation which is pretty similar, highly inspired by GDPR. So in terms of regulations of the market, IT market, I think we follow pretty much the European patterns and standards. Now, I agree with you. What can America do about the Chinese AI stuff? We increase taxes again and tariffs. It's not going to happen, right? It's not going to leverage. So I agree with you. That's why we scratched the surface of this discussion, talking about what comes in, what goes out, how do we do minimal governance across how we develop the AI systems over time. But I don't see regulation. And to be honest, I'm not the largest specialist in the subject, so I can't opinate much about it.
I mean, just to Victoria's point, she's asked a question as well in the Q&A. Should AI ever be given full autonomy to make business decisions? Where do we draw the line? Now, that's a regulation that's self-regulation within an organization, but depending on how good it gets or the perception of the user of how good it gets, because your perception, my perception may be very much different about how good this AI thing is, but the perception of the organization using the AI models or the AI technology to give them answers or suggest an approach or a strategy or a direction or a goal, an outcome, will determine whether or not they are given that level of autonomy. Now, will it be total autonomy, some autonomy? Who the hell knows? But the reality of it is that people are going to use it. And if you're using agents as research agents, it's just research. So you're using the machines to do faster, better, quicker, well, better in air quotes, research than the humans. So I don't know. I think it's going to come down to self-regulation. I think at government level, I don't think there's much we can do. And I think, the problem is most governments are so short-lived that when one government gets in and declares a bunch of policies, by the time they even get close to getting them approved, they're already out of power, and then the next government's changing all of that. So it's going to be down to self-regulation, just like society generally is self-regulating. We have rules. We choose to follow those rules. We choose to align to certain philosophies, and we follow them. And I think that's what's going to happen with AI. I think that's the only thing we can hope for, really. Veronica, we're out of time, I think.
I know we are out of time. I do have one question, which I think maybe Luan could even tackle quickly and efficiently, like we like to do with everything around here. Is AI able to understand the metrics existing in a Kanban system for that specified system, where the metrics are coming from?
Businessmap is made for it. It's by design. That's the real intention of the platform. But that's the easy part of it. If you have the right system, that's the easiest part of it. So yeah, I would say if you stop pretending your system is fine, then AI is not going to save your strategy. It certainly will help to make more execution more smart, scalable, human-centered, but only if we stop pretending the systems are fine.
Brilliant answer.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for sharing your insights. I knew that this would be tough to fit in 1 hour. I never even dared to think that we would be able to. So I think it's very important to mention that we do intend for this to be a series. So we do want to dive into more of these topics, dive deeper into them. So after this webinar, everybody will receive the recording and with it a survey where we please ask you, give us your input on what are the topics that you would like for us to discuss next so that we could give you the best possible and most effective and useful content, because this is such a huge subject and we could do 35,000 webinars. I don't know if we'll cover it, but hopefully we could continue developing these topics and all be better leaders for it and better AI users for it, regardless of what we're using it for. But super last chance, like, is there something that you think absolutely had to be said today that maybe we didn't say in like a sentence, challenging you guys?
I worry about the energy consumption impacting the overall global consumption, leading to unintended consequences, because AI needs a lot of power. I think that's something we can explore in a future webinar. Luan?
My last sentence was brilliant, like you said, Nigel. So I will stick to it.
Don't ruin the highway. All right, awesome. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We will share those insights afterwards as well, and we will be together again. I appreciate you, Nigel, and you, Luan, for giving us your time. And I hope everyone has a great evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Bye.